Nazir, please could you tell us more about the highlights of your career? So over to you.
Thank you very much, Sandy, and good evening to everybody, particularly those from international jurisdictions who, I don't know what time it is for you, but here it's mid-evening. Where does it start? I mean, it started for me as growing up in Birmingham, which is in the Midlands, in a very inner city, working class environment. I didn't have neighbours, I had witnesses, there was just so much crime. We were the subject of enormous amounts of racism and abuse. I think most people around in the 60s and 70s, particularly those of us of colour, ended up doing a lot of sprinting, running away from as much violence that was thrown at us as possible. I'm sure that had an impact on later life. As you just said, I went to University of Birmingham, then I went to Guildford, as it was then the College of Law. My memory of the College of Law, that's a long time ago now, rather limited. What I do remember is I did create a lot of fantastic mnemonics in order to try and remember some of those lists of all those documents that you needed for various areas of law. But as you just said, I was more inclined, I think, to do criminal justice than anything else. Initially, I worked as in a firm of solicitors in Birmingham who were at a defence practice, amongst other things, and I did a fair amount of other types of work, probate, family, commercial, but I always found and I always kept drawn to criminal justice, and it wasn't long before I decided that defending wasn't for me. I pay enormous tribute to those who work in defence law. They do what I couldn't do. I just could not sit there and listen to somebody tell me stuff that I didn't believe, which is my experience. So I decided that I would move into prosecuting. And back in 1990-91, the Crown Prosecution Service, which is the government, the state's prosecution service, was very much in its infancy. It was 4 years old. It was created by an act of parliament which basically said that we can no longer have the police making decisions on both investigation and on also charge. That followed a string of miscarriages of justice cases, including Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, among others, and the independent service was created. But right from the outset, Sandy, the service was utterly disliked by everybody. The police, of course, hated it because it took away their responsibility for cases and decisions on cases. The judiciary hated it because it meant that they didn't have the ability to talk to police officers in the courtroom. The defence community hated it because a lot of former defence lawyers became prosecutors and took away a sizable capacity of their capacity. And the public hated it because we didn't have any money. The Crown Prosecution Service was really poorly funded back then, barely enough money to pay salaries. We were constantly in the news for, quote unquote, losing files because this is pre-digital age. And it was not an environment that you really wanted to be part of. But for me, I think you used the word challenge. It was a challenge. I started in central London. I was extremely fortunate to be working there because I was working at the most famous magistrates court at that time, Horseshoe Road, and the most famous Crown Courts, the OBE, Southwark Crown Court, etc. And my office was in Victoria, which was literally 400 yards, 500 meters from New Scotland Yard. And this was before the days when we had high security. So pretty much on every occasion that I would be going to court, I'd be dropping in on officers there, particularly in the specialist divisions. Because the reason I did that was, going back to my point about the trust. The police didn't trust prosecutors because they assumed that they would simply want to drop cases or tell the police they shouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z. And because trust was low, one way of dealing with that trust is to identify an individual, in this case myself, who would build relationships. You cannot simply assume that people will trust you unless they know who you are. So I deliberately would drop in and I would say to them, right, what have you got? By that time I was a senior prosecutor, heading towards management. What cases do you have that you are just thinking about investigating or just started investigating? And let me know if I can help you. And firstly, they were taken aback. Secondly, the fact that I came to them. And thirdly, that I did so on a regular basis it began to develop the trust. So, for example, with the paedophile unit, which was based, national unit was based in New Scotland Yard in the mid to late 90s. I was absolutely in awe of the officers in that case. Just think about the job that you and I have, and think about theirs. Their job involved getting up in the morning, leaving their families, going into an office, and then spending the next 8 to 10 hours watching indecent images of children, because every single one is a crime scene. You have to identify perpetrators, victims, whether this is a repeat case or basically treat it as a crime scene. And they do that for 10 hours. Then they go home, they love their families, they get up the next morning and do the same thing over again. And when they're working undercover, they are mixing with people that they absolutely detest. But they have to do so in order to collect the evidence, which will ultimately provide a strong case. So by working with them, I was firstly in awe of them. And secondly, I was able to assist them in how they plan their undercover operations to ensure they were legally compliant, ensure that they produced the best evidence. And we were working together with colleagues of mine in the Crown Prosecution Service to build a relationship that was, at that time, unheard of and exceptional. And the reason why, I guess, there's no getting away from it. Once you've seen, as I had, an 18-month-old baby being raped on video, you don't carry on your life in the normal way. Your life must change, and my life did change. And I was absolutely committed to ensuring that those cases were dealt with more thoroughly than they ever had been. And then other high-profile cases came my way. Some of them I can't share with you because I decided not to prosecute them, i.e. there wasn't enough evidence, but they involved very high-profile individuals and high-profile groups. And organized crime became an area in which I began to specialize, and also rape and sexual offenses, largely because I think they were really poorly handled. A lot of people, for example, talk about, I'll talk about more about it later. For example, a lot of people talk about Stephen Lawrence as if it was history. I lived through Stephen Lawrence. It was a murder that took place in 1993 whilst I was prosecuting. It was extraordinarily badly handled by the police. There was national uproar. There was an independent inquiry carried out, which identified that there was some serious issues, systemic issues in every agency, every organization. The phrase institutional racism, it was almost like everybody was jumping on that bandwagon. They felt it was almost cathartic release for them to be able to say, yeah, we are institutionally racist. What they did with it, I'll tell you about that, not a lot, but at the time it seemed to be a sea change in the way things were being done. And to give you an example of that, 9/11, we've just had the anniversary, happened in September of 2001. Almost immediately afterwards, in December of 2001, I became the first Muslim Chief Crown Prosecutor in this country, which says a lot about the tolerance and acceptance of the people that I worked with, my senior managers and the DPP at that time, who put their trust in me. And it was hard because I can assure you there were people who were surprised. I was also, amazingly, the youngest Chief Crown Prosecutor that had ever been at that time. But what it meant was that I was now in a position of seniority. I was also now in a position where I could actually go beyond just the prosecuting of the cases. I was responsible for 150,000 cases a year, everything from road traffic to multiple homicides. And some of them I've written about in my book, so I don't want to touch on them in any great detail. But what I discovered when now I was in this senior role, very senior role, was that I now had the opportunity to do something else, and that was to work in prevention. So it's not just the prosecuting. The prosecuting is fine, and we will get better at doing that, and we will ensure that we're properly skilled. We were now getting enormous sums of money entrusted to us by the government of that time. And now it was also about preventing crime. Why is that important to me? Because every single time somebody is being prosecuted, somebody has been harmed. And I didn't want that. Additionally, what I did do was start opening my ears. And I literally would go around the streets of London and talk to NGOs, voluntary groups, charities, survivors groups, to try and understand the impact of criminality on them. Because to be honest, the best answers come from them, not from the professionals who think that they know the other. We think because we've read something or we've researched something. They've experienced something, and they can probably tell you in great detail what could have been done differently to prevent that harm taking place. And so I'll give you an example. When there was a knife crime epidemic, as there has been more recently, there was an epidemic in the early 2000s. And I said to my teams, let's go and talk to young people and understand why it is that some of them feel the need to carry knives. And the response was, absolutely, let's invite them to our offices. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, nobody came. Why would they come to an anonymous office somewhere in St. Paul's? What we needed to do, and I advised my people to do, was to go to them. And sometimes the only way you can do that is by doing it yourself. So you lead by example. And so I put out feelers to various groups. And for example, one example was I was invited to an event above a bookmakers in Harlesden in North London, which was about 40 or 50 young men, all of them wearing bandanas across their faces. When I asked them if they had a knife, literally every hand went up. I had a little tiny flip pen knife on the end of my car keys, and they laughed at that. But it already we began to hear from them things like our education system, the environment, policing, schooling, the way they are being treated by authority, etc. All of that were reasons that they had. There's no justification for carrying a knife, full stop. But those were reasons that they had, that they believed they had. And so you couldn't just simply say, criminalize it, as we already had, and you add sentences and you lock up people left, right, and center. You've got to stop people actually committing the crimes in the first place. And so I went back to the Home Office and I sat down with the interpersonal violence team, and we developed the first ever serious violent crime strategy that they did, but with my input. And then you'll be surprisingly, when we had the knife crime epidemic, or started a couple of years ago, they dusted it off from the filing cabinet and started using it again, calling it the new, but it wasn't, it was the old. So that was an opportunity then for me to do more of this listening, reaching out, listening, important word. Leaders don't listen very much. They do, like me, a lot of talking. But I wanted to listen, and I wanted to hear what they had to say. And so, for example, women's groups in West London came to me and said, honor-based violence, forced marriage, massive issue in this country. Nobody's talking about it. And my response was, you're right, I didn't know anything about it. Just because I'm brown doesn't mean that I know anything about this subject. So I organized what I thought then was the first national conference for tackling forced marriage and honor-based violence. I subsequently learned from the US State Department, of all places, that that was the world's first conference on honor-based violence and forced marriage. I did it in London. I did it just across the road from Parliament. I enabled members of Parliament to come and listen to survivors, and then it was necessary to do something else. You can't simply have a conference and think that's the end of the matter. We have to change the way it happens. We didn't have any data, so I asked the Metropolitan Police to do me a big favor, actually, and try and identify how many murders had taken place in the last year that were so-called honor-related. And they came back brilliantly using a fingertip search of cases that they said there were 12 that year. We didn't have data. We didn't have data for abductions, forced imprisonments, assaults, sexual offences, but we now had data for homicides. And every homicide back then costs £1 million to investigate and prosecute. It now costs £1.5 million to investigate and prosecute. So there's, never mind the moral case, the legal case, the emotional case, you also have a business case to dealing with something. And I put that business case to government. We created a working group across department, education, health, policing, prosecuting, etc. And we looked at so many things. We defined the subject, so the definition for so-called honor-based violence was defined back then. We used the data to inform strategy and policy. We created awareness campaigns, and we changed the law. So back in 2007 in the UK, the Forced Marriage Civil Protection Act was created, which created protection orders for people who might be at risk of forced marriage. And in the last 12 years, there have been more than 2,500 protection orders, which, you know, on one view is 2,500 lives that have been saved. That legislation was pushed through Parliament by an NGO who literally were struggling because government wouldn't adopt it. It was a private member's bill, but we persuaded the Attorney General and the government and the Prime Minister to adopt it on the basis of that business case. I said to the government, if we reduce the number of homicides by, I don't know, 2, that would pay for the legislation coming into force and all the training, etc. And they agreed with that. And, you know, 15 years on, we've now reduced, still too many, but we've now reduced the number of honor-based homicides by more than half. So I've saved them a lot of money. But, you know, when it comes down to it, those are lives that have been saved. And so I can articulate lots of cases. Those of you in the United Kingdom on the 28th of September can watch one. ITV made a drama called Honour about the murder of Banaz Mahmood. I was the advisor on that. It was part of my cases. And the reason why it's so symbolic is because of the failures of police. Banaz Mahmood was a 19-year-old girl, Iraqi girl, British Iraqi girl, who'd been forced into marriage, who escaped from marriage, who had fallen in love, and then was murdered by her family because she fell in love. And when she had, it was the family wouldn't report her missing. It was important for the police to take this seriously, and they didn't initially. But Caroline Good, the officer who did take it seriously, and her team eventually brought 6 people to justice. So there are 6 people in prison, some of them for life, for the murder of a 19-year-old girl for kissing her boyfriend outside of a tube station. But all of that learning meant that we could develop strategy and guidelines across agency. I spent most of 2008-9, in addition to the prosecuting of the cases, doing a tour of the country, body after body, health, education, social workers, explaining why they needed to change, and they all did. To their credit, they all changed and produced guidelines that would prevent, they think, we hope, more harm. And then we moved on from forced marriage and honor-based violence, I personally did, to child sexual abuse. And some of you will be aware of the Rochdale grooming gang. Let me contextualize first. Most children are sexually abused within the family. That's a massive amount. Second largest group are those who are abused online. Right now, you can watch a child being abused for you for pennies in real time. It's growing and it's disgusting, and we need to stop it. The third largest group of child victims of sexual abuse are institutional victims, i.e. places of worship, education, schools, colleges, even the media. And the fourth largest group are street grooming, of the type that we discovered in Rochdale and many other places. The idea that men would pick on very vulnerable young women who were not being listened to, who were being ignored by the authorities, were often involved in low-level criminality, not because they wanted to, but because they were told to by those who were their predators. And then they think that they're in love, and they're not. They're just being abused and used, trafficked, and ultimately nothing much was being done about it. We prosecuted a group of men in Rochdale for that, and consequently all hell broke loose. I'll never forget May 2012 when the convictions came back. A phenomenal legal prosecution team worked really hard for the Crown Prosecution Service and for those victims, and I'm just lucky that they worked for me in that regard. Prosecutions of those 9 men led to 47 girls ultimately receiving justice. It meant that the country became wide awake to this terrible crime that was happening in its midst. I remember Prime Minister Cameron at that time ringing me up and asking me to explain what was going on. Well, you know, you should know. And then lots of media articles. People, when you do one case and suddenly they think you're the expert, and you have to write articles about the subject. You know, it's nonsense. I'm not the expert. I've kept calling over and over again for research, academic research, in order to understand these types of crimes. But yeah, until very, very recently, 10, 12 years later, the government weren't interested, seemingly. But we've done that. We put that in place. Again, if you're in the UK or in other countries and you have access to Netflix, the BBC made a 3-part film called 3 Girls, which is based on that case. The actor who played me is much more handsome than I am. For a time, my wife had a picture of the actor on the wall rather than me. But that case was symbolic in the sense that I think it did change landscapes. People became wide awake to an issue in its midst. It led to a real discourse about sexual abuse. It led to a real discourse about child sexual abuse. And before people forget it, it was before Savile, it was before Operation U-Tree, it was before all of the celebrity cases that we're familiar with. I prosecuted some of them. Jimmy Savile, I prosecuted his mate. But more importantly, I prosecuted a guy called Stuart Hall, BBC presenter. And the reason I mention that is because of what my failure tells me. He was found guilty of 11 and found not guilty of 1. And I went to see the one woman who did not, in my view, get justice. And I said to her, I'm really sorry that I couldn't give you closure. And she said, you gave me closure the moment that you believed me. And that really has never left me. The idea that people's trauma only becomes recovery when somebody believes them and somebody acts upon that belief, whoever it is. They don't always want a judicial outcome. They don't always want to go to court. What they do want is somebody to say, what you've told me is the truth, and you can now get better, and we can see if we can do something with it. We have to follow the evidence, and there have been many occasions where the evidence hasn't been sufficient. But pretty much every time, though, they go to the jury, people get confused. If the evidence is not sufficient, when the jury come back with a not guilty verdict, that is not a poor prosecution. Prosecutors, it's the judge. If the judge stops you at what we call half time, then that's probably a poor prosecution, unless there's a witness issue. But pretty much every case which was a failure, it was a not guilty, which is not a failure, because we have a system that's innocent until proven guilty, and there will be occasions in which the evidence doesn't reach the high threshold that we require of it and expect of it. Once I'd dealt with that case, I then we had to change again the way we deal with child sexual abuse. So my boss at the time, some of you will know him, Keir Starmer, Director of Criminal Prosecutions, agreed with me that we should set up a national panel that would look at non-recent cases. So we invited police and prosecutors around the country to send us cases that they were concerned about, that they hadn't prosecuted. We then put in guidelines to ensure that people who prosecute these cases do so in a more better way, and so did the police. Police had 43 different bits of guidelines, and now there's one. So we changed the landscape of child sexual abuse, and the greatest thing in the world is that by 2015 we had the highest conviction rate for child sexual abuse in our history. Now that's gone down somewhat, and if you want to talk about austerity and the impact of austerity, I'm happy to talk to you about that. But the principles were that people understood what they were doing. They worked together, multi-agency stuff, and they were delivering justice on an industrial scale. And we were dealing with the fallout, and we were dealing with the issues that arose from that. And we were putting bespoke things in place. The court process was absolute rubbish back in 2011. When the Rochdale girls' victims were giving evidence, they were being cross-examined by 11 barristers over and over again, over many, many days. I don't know how many of you given evidence, but just imagine, 16, 15-year-old, 6 days of being cross-examined, being told you're a liar over and over again. I don't know what that achieves, quite frankly. You didn't achieve anything in that case, obviously. So we now have ground rules, hearings, where the judge indicates how long you can cross-examine somebody, who can do that, etc., etc. So we've changed so much now, which we all must agree requires to be changed. And that, again, is another motto, really, for me, is that if you want something to be different, you've got to act differently. You can't simply assume that following the same patterns, doing the same things, will produce a different outcome. It doesn't work that way. And our organization, the Crown Prosecution Service, at that time was changing. It was morphing into a digital organization, one where it really desperately cared. It was still poorly resourced comparatively, but nonetheless, it was in a better place, and people were getting more and more justice. I left the Crown Prosecution Service in 2015 because I literally had enough. 24 years. And I felt, going back to what I said earlier on, that I could actually achieve more, I hope I could, by preventing harm rather than just simply prosecuting it. And so I took the leap. It was an enormous leap. And it was a great leap for me because it meant that I could start doing international work. So one of the things I started doing was international rule of law reform in Somaliland, more recently in Pakistan, where I've been doing similar. I've done in Ukraine. I've also been working, as Sandra said, as the national advisor to the Welsh government, board positions. They call it a portfolio career. I don't know what I call it, but literally busier than I've ever been in my life. And you can be doing media because why media? Because that's how you get to talk to the largest group of people. No disrespect to any of you and all of you, but you can talk to 1 million people who may not understand the law, and you try and explain it to them in a way that they would. And that's something that people think I can do, and I'm absolutely determined that I will do as much as I can. I do hope more of you will step into that space, because there is a lot of people who are using law for all the wrong reasons and misinterpreting it deliberately. And the more of us, the more of you that are open and talking about how the law is and could be, the better it will be. We need to engage with the public. You know, when I remember when we had a legal strike a few years ago, 2-3 years ago, and I looked at this picture of barristers outside of courts wearing their wigs and gowns and holding placards, and I don't know about you, I didn't think that resonated with the public. You know, if you want to distance yourself from the public, that's how you do it. If you want to ingratiate yourself with the public and get them on your side, you talk to them about the things that impact on them. Human rights being the most obvious one. That if it happens to this particular defendant, it could happen to you. I think that's what we've been doing much more of in recent years. I've never left my greatest passions are around gender abuse, largely because I believe that if we were able to tackle gender abuse, we would be able to tackle so many other criminalities. I mean, there's a great book by Joan Smith, which I reference in mine, which is called Homegrown Terrorists. And the research is clear that so many people who are involved in extremist and terrorist activity also are abusive of women. There was Professor Hilliard at Queen's University in Belfast said the first victim of a terrorist is the woman in his own home. And so if you can tackle the abuse of women and girls, you can tackle terrorism, extremism, serious organized crime, etc., etc., etc. Don't see it as a standalone crime, which of course needs to be tackled, but also think about the other impact it can have. And you can disrupt so much criminal activity, as we've done. I write about it. There's so many activities. One I remember from East London where these men were clearly involved in something very nefarious, but because the evidence didn't reach the appropriate threshold for that very, very serious crime, we were able to identify their abuse of women, which is a very serious crime, and prosecuted them for that, and they went to prison for that. So we were able to disrupt them from the other activities they were involved in, which is a really important point. One of the grooming gangs, so-called grooming gangs that I prosecuted in north of England, I won't say which one, it wasn't Rochdale, when they were waiting trial, the drug trade in that particular town went down by 50%. So you can see the linkages between drug crime and sexual abuse or whatever. There are linkages across the board, and we can do much more, I hope we can, to prevent these things happening by tackling this abuse. And when I work abroad, I'm always keen to challenge activities or behaviors that would ultimately damage the perception of women and girls. I personally believe that there's misogyny. I personally believe that the patriarchy is damaging. I personally believe institutional racism is as clear now as it has ever been. The concept of Black Lives Matter is just an articulation of the fact that there are so many people, including the Rochdale girls and other victims, who are extraordinarily vulnerable and who really do not have the opportunity to get justice, to even be heard. Whether they get justice, we call them sometimes, and I'm guilty of this too, we call them the voiceless. No, they're not. They really have the voice. They're just not being heard. And we're not listening, and we're not acting upon what it is that they're saying and what they're feeling. My commitment to you and to them is that I will ensure that many, many more people like that get their day in court or get heard or get help. Even now, I wouldn't call myself a lawyer. I've never called myself a lawyer. 10,000, 100,000 lawyers better than I am. Every one of you on this call are better than me as a lawyer. But what I'm able to do is turn and make the law accessible and make it real for people who are, I think, the greatest impacted by it. And that's what we have to do much more of, to make them feel that the law works for them. One of the best examples is when we had a tagline, Crown Prosecution Service, was called "Working in the Interests of Justice." But internally, that became working in the interests of just us. The court's convenience, the lawyer's mantra, victims at the center of everything. I don't know about you, never heard it, never believe it, don't believe it either. There are still miscarriages of justice. I don't want people to think it's all about prosecuting. Because if you read the final chapter of my book, I talk about a case involving a woman who's been convicted of murder and spent 14 years now. Not me, I didn't prosecute it, but who I'm now satisfied that there isn't enough evidence to convict her. And so I'm working with a firm of solicitors, with a group of people, to ensure that she gets justice. And so the miscarriages of justice exist. And why do they exist? Because people lie, number one. Because people also have tunnel vision. The example I just mentioned, people focus on one aspect or one outcome. They think this case is about this, and they follow that, and any evidence that might be undermining or insufficient is ignored, and they're just completely focused on that tunnel vision. And that leads ultimately to people being convicted for crimes they didn't commit. And there are people out there who should be convicted for crimes that they have committed. In this context, you mentioned Dominic Cummings. I don't want people to think that it's personal, but it is personal to this extent. On the 8th of April, my eldest brother, died from COVID. He'd been ill. He was isolating at home, and he was told by the hospital that he would get better, go home. The reason why was because the hospital didn't have any space. Simple as that. We all know what it was like at the beginning of April. On the 8th of April, the day in which the most people died, 1,455 people died from COVID that day. One of them was my brother. He died at home. We didn't even know that he had COVID. The positive test came back the next day after his death. We had enormous efforts to be able to bury him. Those of you who know, in Islam, you're supposed to bury within 24 hours. We couldn't do that. We couldn't get a coroner's certificate because he died at home for 6 days. We ended up being given a 30-minute slot to bury him, where 6 members of my family could attend, all of whom had to be able to lower him into the ground because the gravediggers wouldn't do that. And that's what irks me, is that we all made sacrifices and continue to make sacrifices for the betterment of all of us, to ensure that all of us are safe and secure. And there was an individual very, very close to the government, so close that he was probably the architect of these lockdown regulations, very much involved in the decision making. And then immediately after the lockdown regulations were implemented, even on his version of events, he decided to take a family member who was with COVID from London, which was drowning in COVID, to the northeast of England, which wasn't. And that was in total breach of the lockdown regulations. And then you add to that all the shenanigans about where he went or what he didn't do, etc., which, as I say, that I will be very shortly sharing with the world, I hope, the findings that my legal team at Hodge, Jones and Allen have been putting into place to ensure that we the public, understand what happened. It's not about, I'm not here to prosecute him. That's the job for the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, if they choose to. My job was to investigate the case with my legal team to ensure that we have the evidence that you, the public, can make your judgment about, for the public opinion, I guess. And the reason for that is because he was not only unapologetic, he was also surrounded by government, who all, as you probably remember, tweeted, it's over now, let's move on. Well, no, it's not. And as we're now probably going into a second wave or ending a first wave, or continuing the first wave, we know for a fact that it's going to get worse, and we need a reckoning. We can't have a situation where the powerless continue to be powerless and the powerful continue to be powerful. And the law, as I've always found it to be, should operate without fear or favour. It did not matter to me what the colour of the person behind me was in the dock. I didn't care. I didn't know, more often than not. It didn't matter to me what gender. It didn't matter to me where they come from, what their background. It was follow the evidence, and that's all it should be. And then if you have breached it or broken the law, there should be consequences. And when governments decide to break the law, well, that sends out a terrible message about the rule of law. When I go abroad, and some of you work and live abroad, we have a phenomenal reputation in the UK. The Magna Carta, the European Convention on Human Rights, was drafted by many British lawyers. Yeah, we have all of that in place, and yet there is a perception that we ourselves are breaking the law, and that can't be right. We should be standing up for human rights. We should be standing up for the rule of law, because how can we have a conversation with other parts of the world and try to explain to them how they should behave or what they could do differently if we ourselves are not doing anything differently, or in fact we're going backwards? I'll carry on. I'm most proud of my children. They're doing their own thing, whether it's a university or not. I'm most proud of the next generation. All young people should be given the opportunities to achieve what they want to achieve. and they shouldn't be held back by ceilings that they think they have in their head. The only ceiling that they have in their head is the one that they put in their own heads. Hard work, there's no substitute for hard work, and there's no substitute for working together. And we'll be safer. We'll be, I hope, we'll come out of this at some point, this terrible situation we're all in. And I'll get to see you. And I'll get to see all of you, and we'll talk, and we'll read, and we'll make sure that this country is safer, and this world is safer than it's ever been. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you very much indeed, Nazir. And the messages are just coming through from the audience to say very, very sorry to hear about your loss. And great thanks to you for your fascinating and inspiring talk. We've had so many questions come through from the audience. I've been making a note of those. I will start with the first questions that have come through and put those to you if you don't mind. There are quite a few.
Please.
So the first question is this. What advice would you give to a future CPS pupil barrister, but also a current CPS trainee?
I think you're in the right place for starters. I wish there are some regrets I have. I didn't have higher rights until 1998, so 6 or 7 years before I was able to go to a Crown Court. But as a pupil barrister, you can do that now. So I think the training that the CPS puts in place, or certainly did at that time, was exceptional. The opportunities that you get are exceptional, but also remember what I said. It's not just about the process. Lawyers too often get wedded with the process. It's also about the people, and there are some really good relationships that you will have within the service. There are also great relationships you will have outside of the service, and don't be afraid to step out of the office. I remember 91, 92, many prosecutors were really keen to tell their friends they worked for Revenue and Customs rather than say they were prosecutors, because that's how badly we were perceived. Not anymore. And I hope that you have a flourishing career.
Thank you very much. And the next question.
Andy, apologies, just before you go into the second question. Nazir, we're picking up a little bit of background noise, and I'm wondering if your mic is rubbing on your shirt.
Yeah, got it.
Please, lovely. Thank you. Sorry, Sandy.
That's okay. Okay, so Nazir, the question is this. What is the one case in your career that you feel has had the greatest impact upon you?
That's a good question. I can't think. Well, I think Bernard's Mahmood, which is the subject of the honour film that you'll see later on this month, did for this reason more than any other. Because she was murdered by her family didn't even want to bury her with a tombstone. And I sat down with an NGO, ICWRO, which is the Iranian Kurdish Women's Rights Organization, and we put the tombstone on Bernard's body, Bernard's grave, so she would be remembered. And that led later to the National Memorial Day for Victims of Honor Killing, which, by the way, is July the 14th every year. And so I think the point being, somebody has to remember those who've lost their lives as a result of criminality. And that was the first example where I realized that if I didn't remember her, her family certainly wouldn't.
Okay, thank you very much. Could we also have your thoughts on sentencing and the degree to which a sentence passed is justice done?
I always used to get irked about this, because obviously prosecutors don't decide the sentence. In some jurisdictions, prosecutors are able to say, 25 to life or whatever it is that they do. Prosecutors in the UK don't have that privilege or right. Judges make the sentence and they apply the law. And I don't think, go back to what I said earlier on about, we always assume that a judicial outcome or length of sentence determines how serious something is, when in fact it's the impact that it has. And something very, small could have an enormous impact on somebody's life. So Fiona Pilkington was the subject of stalking and abuse because of her disabled child, and ended up killing herself and her daughter. And, that was antisocial behavior. On the face of it, no sentence. It ended up with 2 deaths. So let's not get too worked up about sentencing. Leave it in the hands of judges. But again, my other point is that we all need to start explaining sentences better to the public, rather than allowing certain media types to exploit them.
Thank you very much. And along similar lines, to what extent do you think a prison sentence actually delivers justice?
Well, I write about this in the final chapter. I don't think it does a lot, and that's partly because our ability to rehabilitate has been neutralized over the years. The prison has become, I think, a revolving door. You go in, you come out, reoffend. You go in, come out, reoffend. And what we used to be able to do, or perhaps not as well, but we certainly can't do at the moment, is rehabilitate in prison. And so I want our probation services, I want all the NGOs that work in prison to be celebrated and supported so that they are able to work with people. And you can't, I don't know, you can't work with some offender if they're locked away for 23 hours and you only have an hour out of the cell. They're not really going to be engaging with you. So I think we do need a wholesale look at prison and whether prison works as it is. Prison does work in many respects, but it needs to work better. And that is about more rehabilitative stuff happening in prison and probably supported and funded.
Thank you. And if you had to rank punishment, rehabilitation, reduction and deterrence in order of importance, what order would you put them in?
Oh, wow. It depends what day of the week it is. I mean, I sometimes feel, let's punish them, as being the most important. But in the long term, reduction in occurrence makes us all safer. So whilst you and I might punish one individual for one crime, preventing lots of individuals from committing lots of crimes will make us all safer. So I would imagine that would always come first.
Thank you. And a different question here. After a career with the CPS, have you ever considered a career with the judiciary?
Not in the slightest. I know a lot of judges, and I knew a lot of judges. Being as old as I am, a lot of judges who are recent judges were started up, as junior lawyers back in the day with me. And some of the High Court judges are people who I was briefing, as a baby prosecutor myself. So, it's a different skill set for me. It is, and I can't imagine sitting there and listening to evidence. I'm, in the words of the government, I'm more of an activist lawyer, and I don't imagine I'd be able to be an activist in that environment. So it never appealed to me at all.
Thank you. And what do you think needs to be done to have a judiciary which truly reflects the society that we live in?
Well, it needs to be much more diverse. And by the way, diversity is not about colour or whatever. It's about better decision making. More working class people would make better decisions. Do you really think that the Grenfell fire would have happened had the people making the decisions on the cladding been people who lived there, people who knew people who lived there, So better diversity clearly is necessary. I've come across, sadly, many examples of judges or lawyers who have unconscious racial beliefs, unconscious bias, or even conscious bias. And we need much more. We need younger judges. I'm not averse to the idea of having judges as a separate arm of the legal profession. Where you can actually, I think the United States do this, don't they? Where you can go straight into judiciary from law school. So I'm not averse to that. I think that's necessary at some point. But I think the best thing we could do to have a fully functioning judicial system, justice system, is more transparency. I write about how I personally think that every court proceeding, criminal and otherwise, needs to be streamed, live streamed, with protections for vulnerable witnesses or vulnerable victims or whatever. But that's the way people will get to see what's happening in their name. That will up the ante as far as those of us who work in the system to ensure that we work at more pace, that the problems are more visible. There are thousands of cases waiting to be heard right now, and for example, and the public don't really know that, or unless you're involved, they don't know that. And so if they were able to, I don't know if there are people who watch court TV or whatever it is, but they could. And that, I think, would be probably the game changer for how justice operates in this country, and it would change the way we currently still don't put the public first, we put ourselves first.
Thank you. And what made you decide to become a solicitor?
When I was at College of Law, University of Law, it was just even before then. I was pretty good as an advocate at the university, but I didn't really think that I wanted to just be in court, which I assumed at that time is what a barrister did. I felt that as a solicitor, I'd be engaging more with the public, and I think that's probably what drove me in that direction.
Thank you. And we have two questions along similar lines, which is this: how do you deal with such distressing cases to make sure that it doesn't impact on your health and your relationships?
The word resilience is overused because I don't know what it is. Networks help. When I prosecuted the Rothschild case, I had a large group of far-right thugs outside of my home, screaming and shouting at me, despite the fact that I got every decision right in that case. But nonetheless, I had that. 15 years ago, in another case I dealt with, I discovered that I was on an Al Qaeda verified death list. But I'm still here. So I don't know what the answer is. I think that you have networks. So I have networks of colleagues within work who protected me and ensured that I didn't see all those horrible emails heading in my direction, or letters, or who gave me time to cope with things that I'd been dealing with. We didn't really have counselling. I think we should, and I think we do now. Much more counselling for professionals, but perhaps more of that. And I don't know. When I was writing the book, I remembered what my parents were like, and they didn't have any of the privileges that we have and I have, and they were literally living hand to mouth, but supporting their community and working hard for their community, working all hours. I only knew if my father was home when I saw his jacket on the banister of my house. I didn't know he was working so many hours. So I get a fair amount of that, I think, from my parents.
Thank you. And what do you see are the challenges for the CPS to improve overall prosecution rates without simply reducing the number of cases that are pursued?
Well, the biggest challenge is, despite that, the more resources are coming in to policing and prosecuting and justice generally, it doesn't replace experience. So the regular figure you hear is 21,000 prosecutors, 21,000 fewer police officers in the last 10 years, which will now apparently be replaced by 20,000 police officers, for example. What the figure you don't hear is the 21,000 police officers that have left took with them 500,000 years of experience. And 500,000 years of experience will not be replaced by 20,000 new people out of police school. And the same is true of prosecuting. Enormous numbers of experienced prosecutors left. Because I'm guilty of this. I realize that actually we pay our more experienced lawyers more money, and when I'm told to cut my budget by 25%, I'm going to have conversations with my more experienced lawyers. But that's a really short-sighted way of going about it, because it means you lost your experience. So we will be in a situation for several years to come where we don't have the experience that we had. But I think the commitment is there.
Thank you. And what are your top tips for becoming a great prosecutor?
Whoa, I haven't even thought of that at all, ever. I think great leader, full stop, or great person in position of responsibility, full stop. Listening is the number one. No, don't assume that you know everything. I know nothing, but the people I talk to know everything. And I'm actively listening to quote-unquote experts, quote-unquote the public. And I think that's number one, and number two, and number three. I think that there are others about look after yourself. I'm guilty of this, not doing this, but I think you need to look after yourself. I think that you need to remember what a privilege it is to be a prosecutor, what a privilege it is to be a public servant. I always used to open my speeches when I was talking to the public with, "I am your servant," and they'd all go, "What? I haven't got a servant." No, I am your servant. We're public servants. We're paid for you by you, and I think that we need to change. That dynamic does change the dynamic of the conversation when people realise that we are their servants. And I think prosecutors must always remember that, and they need to be fair. and they need to make sure that they support the police in getting the best evidence, but when they don't have the best evidence, be strong and robust to ensure that cases aren't brought into the system that shouldn't be there.
Thank you very much. It's often said that police come under pressure within the police force to drop investigations into child abuse and or trafficking. To what extent, if any, do you perceive this to be correct?
It was, I imagine, the situation before 2010 or thereabouts. But the pressure wasn't, I don't know, political pressure. The pressure was resources. The cases, I know from experience, prosecuting child sexual abuse is a very expensive thing. You have to have bespoke support, bespoke prosecutors, specialist prosecutors. It can take months and years to get a case on, et cetera, et cetera. So I imagine that resources played a significant role. That, you know, I remember talking to somebody about this, and they said, Nazir, look, if I can prosecute all these really easy cases, well, not easy, but these other cases, and do them over the next few weeks, but doing one of these cases, the child sexual abuse case, would take all those weeks. You know, the difficult cases. So they focused on the not so difficult cases rather than the difficult case. Well, that's a short-sighted nonetheless. But that, I think, is part of it. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm very much a believer in people being more incompetent than otherwise, or being driven by things like resources.
Thank you. And with reference to your comments on wigs and gowns worn by striking barristers and institutional discrimination, how urgent and extensive do you believe is the requirement to reform the profession?
Well, there's a Royal Commission due at some point as the government get their act together. And we need to re-engineer our system. You know, I think that we'll never catch up. With 500,000 the backlog in the Magistrates Court, 45,000 or thereabouts in the Crown Court. We're not going to catch up ever. We're still going to have year-long delays, 6 months, 10 years in the future, unless we look at how the system operates. And so wigs and gowns, ages ago, I would have got rid of them. And strange as it may sound, is that, you know, the public didn't really want it, and you know, they've been told though it makes them, I don't know, it makes it more important if you have somebody with a wig and gown. I don't think so. I think it creates a barrier between you as a lawyer and the public that you serve, or the witnesses that you're working with, or whatever. So I think we need to urgently, and I'll go back to my comment about streaming earlier. We need to urgently review how things are done.
Thank you. Please, can we have your observations about the impact of austerity on access to justice, and how that may or may not feed into societal breakdown or discord and perpetuating inequalities? Discuss.
That's an essay, isn't it? I'd love to be able to. I think it's massively damaging. You know, I mentioned the loss of experience earlier. The fact that you've lost so many legal aid firms and firms who are working at the coalface, for want of a better term, have gone bust or can't operate. Legal aid has been slashed, billions, never mind millions. You can't find a lawyer in many areas of this country who will work legal aid. It's not fair. It means that you're not getting the best advice from somebody for free, which is your entitlement. It means you may not necessarily get a fair trial. It means there will be cases which were either poorly brought or weren't brought or should have been brought. You know, so there's no getting away from it. We are in a really bad place because of what's happened over the last decade. And you know, it's also, why should you have to wait? I mean, I know people who are waiting for trial a year and a half. Both defendants and witnesses, victims, year and a half, 2 years. You know, how can you move on with your life when you know that's happening? Why can't we move at greater pace? And you know, that's not going to happen unless money is invested in the system. And you know, I don't see that happening, unfortunately, in the near future.
Thank you very much. And in light of the recent rape incident that took place in Lahore, Pakistan, what are your views on the current legislations regarding rapists in Pakistan, and what needs to be implemented to prevent this horrific act from continuously reoccurring in remote parts of the country?
I mean, rape is a terrible crime anywhere and everywhere, and I'm very much aware of that particular case that's been referred to on the highway in Lahore, or near Lahore. There you know, I've been doing some work with the officials in Pakistan with the judiciary and prosecutors and police around improving their response to they call it serious sexual violence, SSV. And I've personally seen a real appetite for change about putting the victim centre in a way that they haven't done before. We don't do particularly well either in the UK. And I think they're increasing the professionalism of prosecutors and police officers. They're introducing more forensic evidence, which previously hadn't been utilised as effectively as it could have been. And so I think, it's terrible what happened, but at the same time, I'm confident that the efforts that the government of the various provinces and the national government, just like ours, I guess, have seen what needs to work, and are now beginning to put those things in place.
Thank you. And for aspiring barristers who like a challenge, where do you think is as bracing a place to work now as the CPS was in its early days?
I think anybody working in legal aid right now will probably say that's exactly what it was like, because they get the media attacking them because they're activist lawyers and they're helping all these people who don't deserve it, apparently, and they're not getting any money. So I think legal aid lawyers are pretty much in the same boat that we were in 30 odd years ago. They shouldn't be. But I don't know if you want to work in that kind of environment. If you do, you can. Yes, you can. You'll never be bored, but you will also be able to be really driven. I think you have to be driven in whatever role you're in.
Thank you. And do you think that we are at or nearing a point where the country's government is at odds with its legal system?
Yeah, there's no two ways about it. I mean, the attack on lawyers, the attack on the law, the fact that one case is often used as an excuse to change the sentencing regime or whatever it may be because it's seen as politically or astute when it isn't. The uncertainty that people face about when they're going to be heard or not. And as I said earlier on, if the law is perceived to have broken the law or breaking the law, how do I tell anybody else that they should behave? And we're having this issue with lockdown in the UK, the idea that you are meant to behave and apply the rules that have been given to you, yet you look at what the government are doing or might be doing or seem to be doing and think, well, hang on a minute, there's one law for them and one law for us. Well, no, we are in a really bad place right now.
Thank you. And as a young Asian lawyer, what tips do you have to really progress yourself in a middle-class white male society? Were you, for example, a member of any societies, etc., during your career that helped?
Again, I write about this. I didn't feel part of the profession because I didn't feel like I needed to do what I was told. I was told, go down the pub every Friday evening because that's how you will hear about opportunities and learn stuff. Well, I don't want to do that. I think the answer to you and to anybody is to be yourself. It took me a while. I give you that, but eventually I just became myself and behaved the way I would expect to behave rather than what I was told to do and where I was going. I was a member, I think a founding member of the Law Society's BME group 25 years ago, which I thought was important because what I said about networking earlier, it's important to have good networks. But don't be afraid. Don't allow people to identify you. Define yourself. People used to say to me, they used to call me the Muslim chief prosecutor, Muslim chief exec, or this. I was only Muslim when I was in positions of responsibility and authority and major decisions. They never called me the Muslim member of IPSO or the Muslim chair of a college or the Muslim national advisor. So don't let people define you. Define yourself.
Thank you. And how would you jumpstart a career in the CPS when you're an international citizen and you don't satisfy the nationality requirement to apply for the CPS training scheme?
I'd love to be able to answer that question, but I'm so out of it now. 5 years since I left. I don't know what the scheme says or does. I would hope that the CPS's HR is a bit more flexible than it is, if that's what's happening. I remember recruiting a doctor as a trainee lawyer. You know, we should look for the best people and not just from where they come.
Thank you. And what are your thoughts on the term activist lawyers currently used by the Home Office, etc.? Do you think this term can be damaging to the profession?
Yeah, the way it's being articulated, yeah, it is damaging, because it suggests that somehow that we are, I don't know, using the law for a cause or whatever. We're far from it. You know, we're all activist lawyers because we're actively using the law. But it's been termed in such a way that's clearly seen as being negative and derogatory.
Thank you. And are there any particular organisations that you would recommend where we can volunteer to help careers?
You know, there are plenty right now, I imagine. But what I would do, going back to what I said, is I would start volunteering with NGOs. There are so many organisations. I'm patron of 9 NGOs around the country in Middlesbrough, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, London, Bristol and Cardiff. And, you know, go and work in an organisation at the coalface, working 1 day a month, whatever it may be, which enables you to hear what people are really feeling, really suffering, and then try to identify what the gaps are in your knowledge, but also in the way that you can respond to them.
Thank you. And how do you cope with the pressure of public expectation for justice? And how does this influence your and your team's practices?
Before we came on air, I said that I was asked by BBC Breakfast to go on tomorrow morning about something, and you have to be picky and choosy. I said no. You know, I don't want to be rent-a-mouth, and I don't want to be talking about some stuff I don't know about. I don't want to just simply join on a bandwagon. So you have to be very circumspect about the subjects or issues that you get involved in. And they have, for me, they have to be part of a bigger picture.
Thank you. Another question here. From where I come from, prosecutors are often threatened and their life is put on risk due to prosecuting high-profile cases. There was once an occasion where a female prosecutor was attacked with acid on her face by an angry defendant after prosecuting the case. Do prosecutors in the UK face similar threats linked to their work?
Well, I mentioned earlier on, I have, but I'm the exception, I think, rather than the rule, largely because I put myself above the parapet. I remember talking to a very serious organised criminal, as you do, a long time ago, and I said to him, you know, it surprises me that there are so few touchwood attacks on prosecutors. And he said, "You're just doing your job. If you weren't there, somebody else would replace you. If that person wasn't there, somebody else would replace them." So I think that's very positive, I suppose. But I mean, as I pay real tribute to those who are working in much more hostile environments.
Thank you very much, Nazir. There are no further questions from the audience, but one final question from me, if you don't mind. Given the legal aid cuts to criminal law, what do you see as the future of criminal law?
Well, there won't be a future unless the Royal Commission that the government promised in their manifesto in December last year comes to fruition and does so quickly. The burdens that we're facing in the courts, etc., are getting worse and worse and worse. As I said, legal aid lawyers are falling by the wayside, suffering as a result. Victims will suffer. Everybody seems to be suffering, and that can't happen. So, I'm seriously concerned about the future of criminal law unless there is a root and branch review of what works and what doesn't.
Thank you very much. So that is the end of the questions, Nazir. So thank you very much for your talk, and thank you for entertaining all of the audience's questions. It's been truly fascinating. And thank you very much to our audience for your participation and questions. So Maria, final words from you.
Just echoing your sentiments, Sandy. You've just moved house, Nazir. You know, this is the least of your, tasks for the day. Thank you so very, very much. It's been fascinating and inspirational. Thank you so much, and thank you to alumni for attending.
Thank you all very much.
Have a good evening.
Bye now.
Good night. Bye bye.